On today's episode of Newscast, we will discuss the extreme political significance of these sandwiches. Faisal, as economics editor and somebody with an interest in tech, you'll remember when YouTube first started. Which year?
I'm going to say
surprise everyone.
2005.
Correct.
Oh, good knowledge, Faisal.
Well
I remember
done.
going up to my editor at Channel 4 News saying, this Tubi It's like, this is big. This is really big.
And did they bite?
Well, actually, this year that I actually met Sergey Brin. No, Larry Page, not Sergey Brin.
No, name drop.
And he
Founder of Google.
and he informed me that he didn't read newspapers. And I reported back to my then boss. I said, "There's an issue here. I think these tech guys, they're not really into."
Well, we'll see which one wins in the long term. No, but the reason I bring this up is not because we're having a Christmas pub quiz, much as I'd love to do that, is because Newscast, this podcast, has entered 2005 this week because you can now watch episodes of Newscast, the podcast, every single weekday on YouTube.
Nothing like keeping up with the times.
Exactly. It's only taken us 19 years.
I thought not only is Newcastle not that old, you're not even that old, are you?
No, I am. I remember when YouTube started. I was on a program called John Craven's News Round.
Okay.
So if you would like to watch as well as listen to us, you can go to the BBC News YouTube account and there's a tab on there that says podcasts. And if you click on that, every day you will get Newscast. Or when was the QR code invented? That's harder. If you want to scan
by NASA in 1732.
If you want to scan the QR code that's on your screen right now, that will magically take you to the BBC News YouTube page where you can then watch Newscast after you've watched this one. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
And it's Chris in the Newscast studio, wondering what platform has been invented this year that we will get to in 2044.
And it's Alex in the studio, not wondering that, but now thinking about it.
And it's Faisal in the studio feeling rather chuffed that he got the quiz question.
I'm trying to think what other things we could be on, like Tinder. Anyway, right. So what did you have for lunch today, Chris?
I had a salad and some soup.
And did you think it was for wimps?
Definitely. Without question.
Alex, explain why we've gone down this wormhole.
Well, there's a whole row about sandwiches and lunch. I mean, is a sandwich a lunch or should you have a steak?
And this is Kemi Badenoch in one of her big first interventions as the new Conservative leader. Has basically done an interview with The Spectator saying she thinks lunch is for wimps. And
Lunch
she
is
doesn't
for
think
wimps.
sandwich is a real meal.
No, and if she likes anything, she likes to have a steak rather than a sandwich. And then she also makes some comments about bread. She doesn't like bread in many forms, particularly if it's moist. And this has caused a whole thing, as politicians talking about food seem to do quite frequently.
So she was interviewed by former cabinet colleague Michael Gove, and indeed Katie Balls, who's the political editor of The Spectator, and of course is sat in these chairs. But yeah, it started a conversation today at Westminster, which reached the Prime Minister's official spokesman. And Downing Street were remarkably well briefed around all of this, and quite keen, I think, to sort of lean into it a little bit. So we learned that the Prime Minister likes a tuna sandwich or occasionally a cheese toasty.
I thought he was vegetarian.
Well, I think
No,
he's
he's pescatarian.
Is he?
Yeah, he eats fish. Yeah.
Important.
And then Ed Davey joined in by saying he does think lunch is okay and his favourite sandwich is a bacon sandwich. But then I don't really think of a bacon sandwich as a lunch.
But what didn't Kemi Badenoch also say, that sandwiches are a breakfast thing? And I would say that bacon sandwich is a breakfast thing.
eating sandwich for breakfast.
It did
So we've
sound
got,
a bit
you know-
confused. Sorry, what I don't get is lunch was for wimps, but she has a steak brought to her anyway. So
yeah.
can you
I think
unpack that?
the
Someone unpack
wimp
that.
bit was about having a break
Yes.
as opposed to eating.
Which is interesting because that suggests a potential Kemi Badenoch as prime ministerial approach to working conditions. Like there's a lot of professions where your hours and your break times are actually quite important things and are in your contract and are sometimes subject to quite high level negotiations. For example, if you're working on a railway.
Yeah.
Like there is a serious aspect to this in terms of governing. Although I see you all look very sceptical.
Well, no, but there was the thing about having a steak brought to you as well, which didn't necessarily sound of the people necessarily.
There's just this really interesting thing about, I think, when politicians do things like this, some people can do it well, some people can do it less well. There's a sort of balance to be struck between wanting to show a bit of who you are, a bit of personality, connect with the electorate, So frequently, though, I think it almost does the opposite, Faisal, to the point that you're making. And this is definitely not the only, I don't think many people would consider having a steak brought to them for lunch. I think a lot of people would think a sandwich is quite average, something they might enjoy. But it's by no means the only politicians that have done it, because didn't Rishi Sunak, when he was asked...
Tory splits.
Yeah, he was asked about his favourite meal.
Yeah, during the election campaign on the This Morning sofa. So he was asked about his favourite food, his favourite meal, and he said... sandwiches.
For which he was criticised.
So people were sort of teasing him for the equal and opposite reason. There's one other quote I should bring you, and this is from the file, unsurprising, but nonetheless, I think for the completion of this story, we ought to reflect it. The British Sandwich Association have inevitably been consulted about this.
Let me guess what their position is.
Yeah, no, exactly. But there's an important stat here. Maybe it's one for BBC Verify. We eat 3.5 billion commercially made sandwiches each year. They are part of our heritage. So there you go. And they kind of are, I suppose, aren't they? They are a staple.
I suppose the danger for Kemi Badenoch will be here is that if more people end up hearing about sandwiches and her approach to sandwiches than heard 2 weeks ago that she's proposing a cap on work visas for immigration into the country, then this is backfired.
Well, yeah.
Apart
or
from
not.
being introduced.
I was going to say, the
country, I
counter argument
suppose,
is that they're a party at the moment which is trying where they can to grab a bit of attention and to remind folk that they are there. And with Kemi Badenoch, she still has got some work to do in terms of letting people get to know her. And to the point I made earlier, I think when politicians do this kind of thing, I actually don't think it's easy for them to get it right. A lot of people are sort of willing to leap on whatever they say to go, hang about,
The moistness of the bread.
Yeah, I can't imagine she went into
I mean,
the
I can go with
interview,
that. Soggy bread is no good for
But
anybody.
is
right?
it, or was she talking about...
I don't know.
Dry-
I don't know if that was a reference to sort of, does she prefer sourdough? That's always chewy, isn't it? It's not very much. But the thing is, on the point about the kind of introducing yourself to the country and all that, I don't know because I haven't asked, but I can't imagine the strategy going into that interview was we really must land the point about the soggy bread.
No.
And yet it is that and sandwiches that has become the talking point.
But what we do know her strategy is to kind of do like a root and branch review of what the Conservatives should propose as policies, but starting off with what their actual values should be in 2024, to then have a bunch of policies for the election in 2029. But we're now seeing a downside of leaving that space, that intellectual space, a bit empty, means that it gets filled with this instead.
Yeah, I mean, she does talk about in this interview, albeit in the write-up below the bit about, and this is a kind of quite highfalutin political magazine. This isn't an interview with a tabloid newspaper. She does get into the whole business of the policy commissions and how they approach it. Do they have a Thatcherite approach? Do they have a Cameron approach? Blah, blah, blah. But the crux of it is she does not want to talk specifics now. And the way she formulates it, and again with the food reference, is that if you were planning on opening a restaurant in 4 years' time, would you write the menu now? Now, you might say, well, maybe you would, because if you were a keen, aspiring restaurateur, that might be the thing that drives you. But her view is, no, you've got to get everything else right.
She's at the going to cookery school stage.
Well,
the restaurant.
She's at the idea.
Maybe she's at the concept stage.
The concept stage and making sure
Small
it's a restaurant
place.
that is welcoming and somewhere that people would want to visit, etc.
Right, let's talk about, I can see, Faisal, you're itching to talk about the economy. So let's talk about, let's talk about the government's reforms to the planning system in England that they unveiled today. And Alex, I'll get you to take us through the details in a minute, because I know you've spent a lot of time looking at this stuff. But Chris, just put this in kind of a bigger political context of how important it is to Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner in this case today to get this shaken up.
It's super important because it's one of the big promises that they've made. They've set themselves a target, so that's a target that you might fail to hit. And it matters for its own sake, but it matters too because the overarching promise the government is making is about economic growth, and the two are connected. So it's really, really big for them.
And so, Alex, just give us a sort of rundown of the bits. And I'm aware that planning reforms can get very jargony very quickly.
Yeah, we'll do
as much or as little as
jargon-free. No, we'll go through kind of a jargon-free summary of what this is at. So the government has made some changes to the planning rules in England, and these are the rules that govern basically where houses can be built, what they should look like, how many there should be. And they've been consulting on these changes. Today they've come up with the final version, and very broadly speaking, there are two key things, lots of complexities, two key things. The first thing is there's going to be a lot more homes, and councils right across England are going to have much higher housing targets to meet, 370,000 homes across England per year. That is much higher than anything that has been delivered for decades. A few tweaks to the targets, so a few more homes from London in the southeast than was proposed in the summer, a few less elsewhere, but overall big uplift in the targets. Second thing is the government saying very clearly, I think, to councils, you've got to crack on with this. And if you don't do it, if you don't get on board and crack on, we're going to intervene and take control. And the other bit is part of the way they think councils might be able to get these houses built is looking at the land they've got available in their neck of the woods. And where they don't think they've got enough land that's previously been built on, then they're going to have to, the government says, look at the green belt, bits of the land that are currently protected to stop cities just splurging into each other. And they're going to look at that, and the government says you've got to find low quality bits of that and consider building on that because you have to hit these targets.
And Chris, I'm thinking back to when we started talking about when YouTube was invented. I feel like politicians have been talking about changing the planning system since even before 2005 when YouTube was invented. It's like it's a perennial.
It is a perennial, and the crux of it is a trade-off between the extent to which you allow lots of people to have a say, net result often stuff doesn't happen, versus what would be perceived by a critic as top-down big government treading all over local accountability and a local ability to be able to say, no, there's a good reason why we don't want X number of houses on that particular field. But the bigger context is one where housing targets have so often not been met, and one where there's been a lot of population growth in the last 10, 20 years, and it's a massive issue for so many people. And then politically it's massive for the government because they've decided that they are going to try and badge themselves as the personification of a solution.
I think what always strikes me about this conversation, Faisal, is that actually when you think about the housing industry and why houses get built and how much they cost and whether people can buy them, local authorities in England are kind of like quite down the bottom of the factors that contribute to that.
I think the bigger point is that people think our lack of house building is kind of just part of the weather. It's how things happen. Things don't get done. But actually, it's a sort of inherent part of the way our politics works at a local level. What's quite interesting is because of things like, we reference YouTube again, you can now watch the proceedings of planning committees up and down the country. Every single one is now streamed. And during the election, we had to do...
That's what YouTube's founders were thinking of.
It genuinely is quite interesting to see what happens in planning. Because the act of not building houses is a political economy choice. And it happens in these wet Wednesdays in local councils up and down the country where you get councillors putting up their hands, refusing to build things. Now, they may have very good reasons locally. You add all of that instinct up around the country and you get a house building number which is way off these targets, like so much so that I think my judgment is that these targets, certainly the 1.5 million, won't be met, can't be met. It's a kind of moonshot target, a little bit like some of the sort of pandemic vaccine targets, which we also thought weren't going to be met. But it's a statement of intent to drive home a significant change in the way that these things are delivered and the way in which these decisions are made. The big problem is that when we've had these sorts of numbers even approached before, has only been in a time when the public sector funds directly tens of thousands of houses being built. That is not happening in this case. So you have to ask the question, what is happening in the private house building sector? They are not geared up for this right now. Their share prices has been going down. The sorts of change we're talking about that yield anything like these numbers, even credibly to target these numbers, will be so controversial in every locality. It almost has to be.
Well, just because of the sheer number of
the sheer number.
buildings
Yeah,
built.
it's got to be. It's not violent is the wrong word, but it's got to be like as controversial as anything that Chris or Alex will cover from the politics unit. It's got to be that, but it's slightly disaggregated in different, constituencies and councils. But it's got to be that controversial, more controversial than maybe like immigration or something like that, or Brexit even. It is of that level. Even though people say planning boring, I think it's tremendously interesting. It is a political choice, and if this is going to be even near met, it's going to change in a very significant way.
And it's the one thing that really gets... I mean, like I have sat in those planning committee meetings for years, and people turn up to them because they care. People really care about the development that's taking place in their local area, whether they're pro or anti, what it looks like. It gets people going. And that's why I think this is is going to be tricky.
But isn't it trying to rebalance it? Because actually, what about the people that can't afford to get on the housing ladder? They're never going to go to the planning meeting to be in favour of a development that they probably don't even really know is happening.
Yeah, it's that sort of thing about what is success and failure in a multi-layered, complex democracy. Because, we have these arguments around, say, the expansion of Heathrow Airport or whatever, big building projects. Is a multi-layered advanced democracy working well when there are so many checks and balances that lots of, horrible word, but stakeholders can have a say at one way or another? Or is the net result of that an inertia? Now, some might think that inertia is a good thing, by the way, and others won't. And is it right to have a scenario where the attempt to unblock, as Keir Starmer might describe it, is to effectively remove democratic power from some actors in the chain?
I just keep thinking back to a conversation I had last week on Newscast with Jonathan Reynolds, the business secretary, and it was after Keir Starmer had unveiled his 6 milestones, one of which is the house building target. And I was just saying, well, what is going to give? Because there's lots of things in the planning system that people like, whether it is protecting the environment or protecting nature or making sure that local services aren't overwhelmed. Which one of those do you take away to unblock the system, as he would see it? And he said, well, think about judicial review when things are reviewed in court. You can't judicially review somebody because what they've done has led to the economy not growing fast enough. But then I said, well, okay, the rule of law is one of the things that we like having. So what, you're preparing to get rid of the rule of law when it comes to construction? It's like, well, it's the trade-offs are big.
Yeah, they are. And I think there's a couple of points. I think the first thing is, at the moment, I completely agree with Faisal that the government's almost leaning into this idea that we're prepared to take you on. We think this is the right approach. Bring it on, But I think what they are actually doing in practice is trying to sound really tough on councils, with the threat hanging over them that if you don't get on board, then we will step in and do this, i.e. take over and decide what bits of land that can be built on or not, in the hope that councils do, because it will be much less of a headache.
It's just
if
giving them a big shove, isn't it?
A massive shove. It will be interesting to see how far they take that in reality. Do you know what I mean? If there is a real local pushback somewhere where they're like, sorry, no chance, what then they actually do in practice will be interesting. But the other point I would say about it is that for opposition parties who are pointing to this and saying, you've got to have local democracy, councils have to have a say, they are also saying, but we do have to build loads more homes. So it is, and that hasn't happened, as we've said, in successive years, to the level that the government's now trying to achieve.
I think it also kind of works the other way, though. The danger here, the jeopardy is they're going to back this policy at the macro level, and then we're going to find in each minister's backyard, are they really backing this? There's going to be a ton of examples of that. There's a bigger point here, which is about house prices. I put to Matthew Pennycook a couple of months ago, the housing minister, I said, so at the end of the result of whatever it is you're planning before they settled on it, are you going to expect house prices to come down? I mean, that would be become more affordable for that army of people that can't get on the housing ladder. And it's just like a toxic question. No one wants to go there. No one wants to, this did happen in Spain. In Spain, during the housing boom, they built millions of houses and house prices stagnated. It came down in real terms. And people that wouldn't have otherwise got on the housing ladder moved into some of those homes, and it changed their economy, made it more productive. It's doing quite well now, by the way. So I think that this is a big challenge about generations and generational equity, but also there's some sort of potential for some challenges around consistency, potential hypocrisy, if they're seen to challenge local scheme.
Here's a scenario. It's like 2 years before the election. The target's nowhere near being hit. Rachel Reeves has got credibility from the markets to maybe borrow a bit more. Do we see a massive old school style social housing building programme in the last 2 years of this parliament to help Labour get to their targets? And it's sort of, they can justify it because of everything we've just been saying.
Some housing investment now as infrastructure. But what comes with that, which is fascinating, and people might be more entertained, is what does this look like geographically? New towns. What's going to happen? We're going to let Cambridge and Oxford grow hugely because that's an engine of growth that's been restrained. They're going to they are building, I think, a fast train line between those two cities. What's going to happen in the middle? It's actually, if this works, the geography of England will change substantially. Be in no doubt about that.
Then you've got the twist of, look at the Parliamentary Labour Party now and where Labour have MPs, including in lots of rural seats. Fast forward those couple of years, and they can see the election on the horizon. Not just those in rural seats, everywhere. and they're getting a bit of grief locally from their local authorities, from potential constituents. You have a particular project that might be sitting there for, 300 new houses, whatever it might be, and a huge local campaign in opposition. What do you do?
And of course, Keir Starmer, as a constituency MP, opposed HS2 because it goes through his constituency.
There are many examples of where MPs have opposed local house building or other projects, and then again stood up and spoken about the need for us to kind of get building or more infrastructure or all the rest of it. The other thing, of course, there's all of those political challenges, but there are also practical challenges. And you alluded to this, Faisal, about the capacity in the construction industry to ramp up in time, also capacity in the planning sector to put these local plans in place and get applications decided. The government is putting in some more planning officers, but that's something that comes up time and time again. And the big one you touched upon is infrastructure, because one of the biggest bugbears for people who are opposed to development is when the homes are built, but the roads, the schools, the GPs aren't. And the government's being very insistent that that's all going to go hand in hand. And there is this infrastructure bill coming through in the early part of next year as well. But I think all of that are kind of some of the practical challenges, and that they really need to get in the weeds of if they're going to make this happen.
Faisal, tell us about your trip to Brussels at the start of the week.
Oh, yeah. So I managed to be a stowaway in the back of the Eurostar office, and I've been back since the kind of, Brexit. I think Brexit.
You have to get a stamp on your passport.
Brexit cast was still probably coming out at that point. But yeah, no, I went. The Chancellor was in Brussels. I got there at 6 a.m. Eurostar over there. And she's made a big deal of this. And she was briefing the Brussels journalists, and my sense is that you have a big meeting today, which we'll go on to. You have one of the foreign ministers also in Berlin. And the mood music I get, given their constraints, is what we have thought of as being quite a constrained, technical, small tweak type move next year in terms of trying to get closer to Europe, what they're calling the reset. That it might be far more expansive than we think. It won't break their red lines, not rejoin the single market, the customs union, freedom of movement. But particularly because of two things that have happened. They've got a lot of feedback since the investment summit from business that are angry about things like the budget, and they feel like breaking down some of the trade barriers that were created from leaving the single market and customs union in certain sectors.
Might be a quid pro quo for putting up employers' national insurance contributions.
Yeah. So if you can export totally freely, or as near as that as possible, in the food sector, maybe many goods sectors, that's a possibility. And then more generally, the sense I got from my Brussels contacts were that there were a sense of very tough things being put on the table by the Commission, and this we get into the criminology here, which is important. And the Commission, parts of the Commission are very happy with the settlement. In Britain, it's stable and all that sort of stuff. But the Council, the European Council, which is the political leadership, in a changed world with Trump tariffs going God knows where, they see a real political impetus in keeping the UK, whose government's instincts is to come back closer to Europe, to lock that in.
And I did notice in Rachel Reeves's speech, one of her big priorities to the finance ministers was, we will help you in the battle to keep free trade free. Now, that's quite different from what Keir Starmer says when he's asked to pick a side between Donald Trump and Europe. He says, I'm not going to pick a side. But that's Rachel Reeves kind of picking the EU side if she says that.
Well, and I think let's just pick one example. There's many different things. So the bottom line is, I think next year we are actually going to get a summit, a political declaration, the EU27 coming up with a negotiating mandate, and then a proper negotiation. We're going to feel a little bit like it's 2018. And maybe, and this is my thesis here.
Happy New Year, Adam.
My thesis. So Brexitcast comes back on YouTube.
The best present.
My thesis here is that although the bureaucrats don't want to have cake and eat it, they like the deal as it is. It's settled. It's stable. Because of the political diplomatic situation, there may be some small amounts of cake on offer, maybe a small muffin, for the UK in terms of breaking down trade barriers that exist. And I'm going to throw something back at you guys, because there's also, people in Brussels have noticed this really obscure bill that's going through the House of Commons and House of Lords, the Product Standards and Metrology Bill, right? Which apparently gives your former guest, Johnny Reynolds, the power to align with the EU in certain areas for goods. And they see this as a route through which you could get a more widespread alignment. Now, the politics of that is for you guys to discuss. Certainly, there are businesses that would quite like that. Some of the markets might quite like the idea of all that. And there's a question as to, is this rowing back on Brexit, that whole argument? Or is this reflecting Labour's coalition that has actually elected it, which is less bothered about whether the ECJ have this power, that power, or its consequences elsewhere?
And then to the next item in the diary, just a couple of weeks after the inauguration of Donald Trump, and the Prime Minister will head to Brussels himself, beginning of February, to meet other European leaders. And what's interesting is that invite has been sent, but also you've got a Prime Minister who is saying yes to that invite, because you could imagine more recent Prime Ministers, when Brexit was closer in the rearview mirror, would have not wanted to entertain that kind of trip. And so the context of that, off the back of the Chancellor's visit and the arrival of Donald Trump and all of this other stuff that is floating around, I know from speaking to EU folk that, they have clocked that there's been this change of government, and that the outlook of this government is very different from its predecessors, that where the sentiment within the Labour Party versus the sentiment within the Conservative Party completely different. And that'd be, that's quite a thing. You just imagine the Chancellor going, the Prime Minister going to meet other European leaders, where he knows he will have some people saying, hang on a minute, he's going to go out and sell out Brexit, etc., etc. Tells you quite a lot about where they are willing to entertain, even just in an optical sense, let alone the detail, that relationship.
Although it is interesting, because while they have been so loud and repeatedly talking about the fact they do want to reset the relationship with Europe, they have put that forward as a positive, they have also been quite cautious to publicly say how firm they're sticking to within their red lines and reiterate that. Because so it's like, whatever the private conversations, I think there's going to still be a very cautious tiptoe around the public messaging about.
I just think my neurons are firing now. Just a few unplanned thoughts. It's so different from the Brexit negotiations. Just think the glare of the spotlight that was on every single thing, and every utterance of every minister was reported back in Brussels and interpreted. Those days are gone now. Also, we kind of forget that Boris Johnson and Lord Frost, his negotiator, took an uber sovereigntist approach to Brexit. They were like, right, nothing that, even things that maybe they might instinctively quite wanted, they're like, no, we're not going to do that, because we want to have what people used to call a hard Brexit. And so that's totally gone. And I just think you can, once you like deprioritize sovereignty, and once you do it all on the hush hush and make it very much more technocratic, then there's lots of options.
Nick Thomas Simmons, who's going to be heading up ministerially this negotiation, he was in front of the Lords this week, and he made a very interesting point, which he said there is no sovereignty issue. If the UK duly elected government with a big majority decides to pursue its objectives in the national interest and decides we want to align on good standards, because business is telling us to. This is another difference, by the way. Business is now going to talk freely when they were probably told to keep quiet under the previous government, so you're going to get that pressure. Then if we think it's in our interests and we decide to align, that's our choice. This is like a sovereign, no one's forcing that upon us. The test of this will be the veterinary deal. That was in the manifesto. Now, you can get quite a distant veterinary deal, a la New Zealand, or you can get basically single market membership for food and farm exports with almost no checks apart from for customs. Now, I assumed it would be over here, but I'm just like, my spidey sense says it might be closer to the Swiss model.
They keep adding things that they would like to do when originally there was a very small list of things. Right, the thing I'd like to do now, Chris, is give you your sort of newscast Christmas present.
Oh, we all get one.
No, just Chris.
Unbelievable. Not coming back.
Didn't know you guys are coming.
You might be
Chris,
relieved.
your Christmas gift is a classic newscast gimmick.
Oh, is it great?
And it's called, this year's Christmas newscast gimmick is called Father Chris Mason.
Oh, that's good.
Right, that's very good.
We have commissioned a no expenses spared animation, Chris Mason themed animation of you in a Santa hat.
Oh, right.
With some snow gently falling.
Wow.
And the challenge is for people to take photos and videos of that video in as many places as they possibly can. And the most intriguing places as well. Almost like, when you track Father Christmas's actual progress.
Absolutely, on the big night.
We're going to track Father Chris Mason's journey
I'm
around.
sure it'll be just as global.
Does that make sense?
That photo. I'm always a bit suspicious about that photo. I sort of
Is it the Santa hat? Do you not remember wearing that?
That's been glued on, hasn't
that's
it?
And you've not got a coat on in the snow.
But I think the rest of it looks a bit sort of like it's been mucked about with a bit. Probably in an enhancing way, I hesitate to add. But my face looks a bit kind of, I don't know.
I think that's a good photo, Chris.
Yeah, no, there are many worse.
The
There
main
are
thing is it
many
looks
worse
very
ones.
Christmassy. So
Yeah, no, it's wonderful.
So I will post that video on all my social
Wearing the
medias.
same shirt.
Well, blue. I mean, Adam Fleming on Twitter, Adam Fleming on Instagram, and we will pop it in various places in the BBC on social media as well. And
Terrific.
there's a thing called Discord you can download as well, where you can interact with all of us about the podcast. And then you have to do your best Father Chris Mason travel and filming to show us where he's ended up. And that's us. Got to the end of this episode of Newscast, which is our last one on BBC One for 2024. So I'll say have a good Christmas break if you get one, and we'll see you again in 2025. Bye.
Bye-bye. Happy New Year.